There is a number most people never check about the people they envy. It is not income. Income is easy to guess from a driveway or a jacket or a restaurant order. The number that actually matters is invisible. It lives on a balance sheet nobody posts. And the gap between what that number really is and what everyone around you assumes it is turns out to be one of the most consequential distortions in modern life. Here is what that distortion looks like in practice. Research on high earners shows roughly 4 in 10 households bringing home 6 figures finish the month with nothing carried forward. The personal savings rate in early 2026 sat near 4.5%, about half the historical average, while spending per household climbed to record levels. More than half of adults could not absorb an unplanned $1,000 expense without borrowing or selling something. The median emergency balance across surveyed households was around $600, not $6,000. These are not numbers describing struggling households in obvious distress. These are numbers describing households that, from the outside, look completely fine. The cars are new, the homes are large, the vacations appear on schedule. The math underneath does not add up. That gap between appearance and reality is not accidental. It is the product of a specific system, and understanding how it works changes how you see almost every financial decision you will ever make. Spending is rarely about the object. That is the first thing to understand. Every major consumer purchase carries 2 price tags. One is printed, the other is social, and it is the one doing most of the work. For most of human history, visible signals of resource abundance carried real survival information. Status was a shortcut to understanding who was safe, who was useful, who was worth aligning with. That instinct remains fully intact. What changed is that the signals got commercialized. A car badge, a kitchen renovation, a phone model, a resort tag in a photo. None of these carry survival information anymore, but the brain processes them as if they do. This is why economists can describe a category of goods that become more desirable as their price rises. The expense itself is the message. Remove the expense and the message disappears. The trap is that the audience receiving this message is simultaneously sending one of its own, and almost no one in the exchange is actually watching. Everyone is performing for a crowd too occupied with their own performance to register yours, which means the entire system produces social signal at enormous financial cost for effectively zero return. The economic term for the exhausting treadmill this creates is hedonic adaptation. The new purchase delivers a real emotional lift for a short window. Then that purchase becomes the new baseline, the lift evaporates, and the threshold for the next lift moves upward. Each upgrade resets the floor. The feeling of having arrived lasts weeks, not years, and the cycle demands another purchase to recreate it. Household income rising into this system does not slow the treadmill, it speeds it up. Every raise arrives as perceived permission to raise the lifestyle to match, which means the gap between income and spending stays roughly constant regardless of how much the income grows. One upgrade is never one upgrade. That is the mechanism almost nobody factors into the original decision. A single elevated purchase silently renegotiates the standard for everything around it. One genuinely beautiful piece of furniture makes the surrounding room look inadequate. The floor, the lighting, the adjacent furniture all drop a grade relative to the new anchor. The upgrade did not cost one purchase. It quietly committed the buyer to a sequence of purchases that will run until the entire environment matches the new baseline. The same cascade operates at the level of neighborhoods, social circles, and zip codes. Moving into a higher status area does not just change the mortgage, it imports a set of unspoken expectations about the cars in the driveway, the schools, the renovations, the version of daily life that fits the address. Each of those expectations carries a price, and most of them were not in the original calculation. This is why researchers find that genuinely wealthy households tend to live in notably more modest homes than their net worth could support. They are not unaware of the nicer options. They are aware of what the nicer option would obligate them to acquire next. The total cost of a purchase is the purchase price plus the full downstream cascade it initiates, and that second number is almost never written on the tag. Understanding the cascade is what separates a financially sophisticated decision from a financially naive one that feels sophisticated in the moment. The car is the most visible entry point into this system, and the numbers around it have reached a genuinely striking scale. The average transaction price on a new vehicle recently crossed $50,000. The average monthly payment climbed to near $770, a record. To make payments at that price level fit into monthly budgets, loan terms have stretched to lengths that would have seemed extreme a generation ago. More than a third of new car loans now run past 6 years. Terms beyond 80 months are increasingly common on vehicles that begin losing value the day they leave the lot. A new vehicle typically loses 20% or more of its value in the first year. Over 5 years, the depreciation can consume more than half the purchase price. Someone carrying an 80-plus month loan passes through a long window where the outstanding balance exceeds the car's current market value. If that vehicle is totaled or needs to be sold during that window, the loan does not adjust. The borrower owes the gap between the balance and whatever the car is worth at that moment. Across all American households, outstanding auto loan balances have crossed $1.67 trillion. The car, which functions culturally as the clearest badge of financial arrival, has become one of the heaviest anchors on household balance sheets. The same logic runs through real estate, though the mechanism is subtler. A larger home is not one larger expense. It is a multiplier applied to insurance, property tax, utilities, maintenance, and furnishing. Every additional room exerts quiet pressure to be filled. The square footage that felt like abundance on the tour becomes a continuous obligation once occupied. Credit card debt adds a third layer. Carrying balances at interest rates near 21% does not just cost the purchase price, it adds a substantial fee for the privilege of making the purchase before the money existed. Total household debt in the United States crossed $18.8 trillion in early 2026. A meaningful portion of which represents lifestyle performance rather than essential expenditure. While income announces itself loudly, the number that actually determines financial security stays almost completely invisible. Net worth, assets minus liabilities, is the real score. It is what remains if the income stops. The median household net worth in the United States sits near $192,000. The widely reported average of roughly $1 million is distorted upward by a small number of extremely wealthy households. The median is the honest figure, and it reveals that most households own far less than their spending patterns suggest. For households under 35, the median net worth sits near $39,000, a number that stands in sharp contrast to the new vehicles and upgraded apartments visible in that age group. Research consistently finds that savings rate is a stronger predictor of long-term wealth accumulation than income level. A household earning modestly but saving a consistent fraction of every paycheck can arrive at retirement in a stronger position than a high earner who consumed nearly everything they made. The faucet size does not determine the outcome. The drain does. Once this becomes clear, the entire visual landscape of a neighborhood stops being readable in the way it once seemed. The heavily leveraged household with the new trucks and the boat may be one disruption away from liquidating everything at a loss. The quiet neighbor driving an older, paid-off car may be sitting on a portfolio that would be genuinely surprising. The signals trained into us as wealth markers are, far more often, signals of spending. And spending and wealth are not parallel tracks. They frequently run in opposite directions. The data on genuinely wealthy households is counterintuitive enough that it still surprises people who encounter it for the first time. Research on high-income earners found that 61% of households bringing in more than $250,000 annually do not drive luxury vehicles at all. They drive mainstream brands, the same reliable makes filling ordinary driveways, despite being fully capable of financing the badge. Studies of American millionaires found that the typical one allocates roughly 1% of net worth to vehicles, while the typical aspiring wealthy buyer allocates closer to a third. Fewer than a quarter of the millionaires surveyed were driving a current year model. They bought used, maintained carefully, and replaced only when the vehicle stopped performing its function. Approximately 69% of millionaires surveyed never earned a six-figure household income in a single year. Around 80% built their wealth without an inheritance. The profile that emerges is not exceptional income meeting ordinary discipline. It is ordinary income meeting exceptional discipline sustained across decades. The underlying principle, stated as plainly as possible, is that the resources spent performing wealth are unavailable for building it. Those two activities are not just different, they pull in opposite directions, and every dollar has to choose a side. The shift happening at the cultural level reflects this. Among genuinely high net worth individuals, conspicuous branding has begun to read as a signal of insecurity rather than a rival. The visible logo now marks someone trying to communicate upward. The absence of a logo marks someone who no longer needs to. Quality without announcement, function without performance, longevity over novelty. These are the operating characteristics of households that are actually accumulating. There is a layer beneath net worth that matters more than the number itself. It is what the number permits. A balance sheet is not just a score. It is a set of future choices that either exist or do not, depending on what was built. The ability to leave a position that has become untenable. The ability to absorb a family emergency without financial collapse. The ability to pursue an opportunity that does not come with a guaranteed salary attached. These are not abstract luxuries. They are concrete decisions that either belong to a person or do not, and the difference is entirely determined by the gap between what they earn and what they spend. A household earning generously but consuming nearly all of it has almost no real options. Every month, every obligation must be met, which means every major life decision gets made under the constraint of that requirement. A household earning less but spending well below it holds genuine leverage. It can take time. It can choose. It can say no. That leverage is what wealth actually purchases when it is functioning correctly. Not the object, not the signal, not the appearance. The capacity to make decisions on your own terms. The clearest illustration of this is what happens to two people with identical starting points when an unexpected disruption arrives. One has been directing a fifth of every paycheck into investments for years. Their lifestyle never inflated to consume the raises. The disruption is uncomfortable but survivable. They wait for the right opportunity and take it on their own schedule. The other consumed each raise as it arrived. Their obligations grew in proportion to their income. The same disruption immediately becomes a crisis. The first job offered gets accepted regardless of terms because the obligations did not pause. Same starting salary, same duration, same external event. Completely different outcomes, produced entirely by the architecture each person built across the preceding years. The households that build this architecture quietly tend to operate from a consistent set of principles, none of which are complicated. The first is to treat income growth as a wealth-building event rather than a lifestyle upgrade event. When a raise arrives, the gap between income and spending widens rather than closes. The new income flows into accumulation, not into a higher baseline. The second is to make the right behavior automatic and make the wrong behavior inconvenient. Investment contributions transfer the day income arrives, before any discretionary decision is possible. Friction gets placed deliberately between impulse and purchase. Removed payment credentials, waiting periods, unsubscribed promotional flows. The goal is not willpower. The goal is to never require it. The third principle is to define the unit cost of anything before buying it. Total price divided by realistic usage. A well-chosen item used hundreds of times can be among the most economical purchases made. An impulse buy used twice is among the most expensive, regardless of the sticker price. The fourth is to treat new interests as hypotheses before they become inventories. Testing cheaply, renting, borrowing, using an entry-level version filters out the majority of enthusiasms that would have become expensive and short-lived equipment collections. The fifth, and perhaps the least discussed, is to define what enough looks like before the money arrives. High earners who never set a ceiling keep moving the target upward with every income increase, which is why so many of them remain financially stretched despite objectively high salaries. A household that decides in advance what a sufficient life costs and treats every dollar earned beyond that figure as future capital accumulates at a pace that looks almost mechanical from the outside. The sixth principle is to curate the comparison environment. A significant portion of the pressure to perform financially does not arise from lived experience. It arrives through a screen, from people who are themselves performing at audiences who are themselves performing. The genuinely wealthy tend to measure progress against their own defined targets rather than against what is visible in other people's highlight reels. That orientation can be deliberately adopted. Every principle described in this video sits on top of something, and when that underlying layer is absent, the principles collapse under any real pressure. Two people can read identical advice about compound growth and automated investing. A year later, one of them has a functioning account they barely think about. The other sold during the first significant market decline, locked in a loss, and withdrew from the entire approach. The advice was the same. What differed was whether each person understood the mechanism well enough to hold their position when the mechanism felt like it was failing. Rules followed without understanding are fragile. They hold during calm conditions and break precisely when they are most needed. Understanding the difference between debt that builds a position and debt that erodes one. Understanding how compounding rewards patience and punishes interruption. Understanding why a savings rate outpredicts income over a long enough horizon. These are not advanced concepts. They are the foundational layer that determines whether every other strategy actually functions. The reason so many high earners arrive at retirement with inadequate reserves is not that they never heard the advice. They absorbed the advice constantly. What was missing was the framework that makes the advice coherent rather than arbitrary. A rule without a framework feels like superstition. Superstition does not survive a bad quarter. Understanding is what converts a fragile rule into a durable habit, one that holds when markets fall, when a convincing alternative appears, when the social pressure to spend becomes genuinely loud. Everything in this video points toward a single underlying distinction. Income is throughput, wealth is accumulation. The size of the flow does not determine what remains. A household with substantial income and no gap between earning and spending owns, in any functional sense, very little. A household with modest income and a persistent, disciplined gap between earning and spending is accumulating real freedom with every passing month. The external signals we were trained to read as markers of the first group frequently belong to the second, and the quietest households in the room are often the ones with the most genuine options. The architecture of real wealth is not dramatic. It is automated transfers on payday, reliable vehicles maintained past the point of boredom, spending defined by function rather than signal. It is a ceiling set before the income arrives, a comparison environment deliberately narrowed, an identity that does not require external validation through consumption. None of this looks like success from the outside. That is precisely the point. What it produces over time is not the appearance of freedom, it is the actual thing, the capacity to make the choices that matter without being constrained by obligations attached to a performance nobody asked for. The gap between looking wealthy and being wealthy is not inevitable. It is a product of specific decisions made repeatedly in a specific direction. Understanding that clearly, not just as a rule but as a mechanism, is where everything else begins.